Solid tales, history uncovered. In the sweltering, oppressive summer of 1944, deep within the claustrophobic, reinforced concrete bunkers of the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, the German High Command was breathing a collective, albeit misguided, sigh of relief. The catastrophic invasion at Normandy had crashed against the Atlantic Wall on June 6th. It was a brutal, blood-soaked assault, but as the weeks dragged on, a dangerous illusion took root in the minds of the German generals. In their eyes, the hemorrhage had been contained. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, an aristocrat of the old Prussian military tradition, had been recalled to command OB West after the explosive July 20th bomb plot shook Adolf Hitler's inner circle to its core. Standing in his headquarters outside Paris, von Rundstedt surveyed the operational maps with a mixture of stoic resignation and lingering optimism. The Allied bridgehead was still stubbornly narrow. It was geographically hemmed in by the treacherous ancient hedgerows of the Normandy bocage, a claustrophobic green hell where determined German counterattacks turned every single field into a slaughterhouse. The elite panzer divisions, though severely depleted and bleeding veterans daily, were holding the crucial lines at Caen and Saint-Lô, reports flooding in from Army Group B, under the command of Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, painted a grim picture of a slow, grinding war of attrition. The Americans were pressing at an agonizingly slow pace in the Containment Peninsula. The British and Canadians were bogged down in a muddy stalemate in the east. Ammunition was dwindling. Replacements arrived in pathetic trickles. German fuel shortages were becoming chronic, gnawing at the operational capacity of the panzer groups. Yet the front somehow held. Adolf Hitler, totally ensconced in his eastern headquarters, miles away from the smell of cordite and rotting flesh, issued rigid, suicidal orders for an unyielding defense. He forbade any tactical retreats that might surrender a single inch of ground. His generals sat in heavily guarded briefing rooms, their faces frozen in masks of blind obedience, while privately nursing terrified doubts about the strategic madness of bleeding their best divisions, white in fixed static positions. Then came the end of July. Intelligence intercepts began to whisper of massive, apocalyptic Allied preparations west of Saint-Lô. Reconnaissance spoke of ungodly concentrations of heavy artillery and waves of bombers gathering like a storm. On July 25th, the illusion of containment was violently shattered. The sky over the German lines did not just darken, it turned completely black. Thousands of American heavy bombers blotted out the sun, carpeting the earth with high explosives in the devastating opening phase of Operation Cobra. The earth shook so violently for miles that seismographs could have registered it. Frontline units of the 5th Fallschirmjäger and the elite panzer divisions were physically pulverized. Command posts were vaporized into craters. Entire battalions of German infantry were instantly buried alive in their shattered dugouts. The survivors, suffocating in the thick, chalky dust, stumbled backward in profound shell shock. Their frantic radio dispatches to OKW were fragmented, incoherent, and filled with sheer panic. A catastrophic breach had been ripped wide open. The American armor was no longer knocking on the door, it was pouring through the shattered wall. At OKW headquarters in Rastenburg, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, pored over the frantic initial telegrams under the dim, flickering light of the map room. Desperate to maintain control, the High Command convinced themselves the breakthrough was localized and containable. Counterattacks were frantically ordered. The battered remnants of panzer divisions were hurled blindly forward to plug the bleeding gap. Hitler, briefed during his midday conference, raged at what he perceived as cowardice from his frontline troops, completely blind to the overwhelming material reality of the battlefield. The German generals anticipated a slogging, methodical American advance. They expected the Americans to secure their flanks, pause for logistics, and give the Wehrmacht the precious days required to fortify fallback lines along the rivers and ridges of France. But the pace of the enemy defied all known military expectation. It defied logic. By July 30th, the American forces had aggressively seized Avranches, the vital gateway to the Brittany Peninsula and the open, undefended French plains beyond. German scouts frantically reported endless columns of enemy tanks streaming southward and eastward, utterly unopposed in multiple sectors. Monitoring the disaster from his Parisian headquarters, von Rundstedt noted a terrifying anomaly. This was no longer a grinding war of attrition. This was fluid, highly mechanized, unstoppable movement. On August 1st, slipping into the line almost unnoticed amid the apocalyptic chaos, a new beast was activated, the 3rd United States Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton. In German intelligence dossiers, the name Patton carried immense, terrifying weight. He was profiled as wildly aggressive, dangerously unconventional, and an absolute master of armored exploitation, a reputation forged in the bloody campaigns of Sicily and North Africa. Whispers of his temporary relief following the infamous slapping incidents had circulated through the German ranks, leading to rumors that the Allies had sidelined their best armored commander. Now, the leash was off, the phantom was unleashed. Patton's forces moved with a terrifying velocity that completely stunned German observers. His 12 divisions fanned out across the French countryside like the iron fingers of a colossal hand. One armored thrust violently secured the ports of Brittany, while others wheeled aggressively east, pointing like daggers toward the Seine River. In the first frantic days of August, disaster reports flooded OKW Coutances fell. Then Granville, the historic Breton towns of Rennes and Vannes, changed hands in a matter of hours. German garrisons, totally isolated, completely out of fuel, and abandoned by their high command, either surrendered en masse or fled in terror. Patton's armored spearheads deliberately bypassed heavily fortified resistance nodes, leaving the trapped pockets of German defenders to be systematically dismantled by follow-up American infantry. What truly paralyzed the Wehrmacht was the logistical nightmare. While German panzer crews were forced to abandon their magnificent Tiger and Panther tanks because their fuel tanks were bone dry, Patton's supply trucks, the legendary Red Ball Express, rolled forward in endless unbroken convoys. They were fueled not just by American industrial might, but by captured enemy stocks. Above them, Allied air superiority was absolute. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons strangled any attempt at Luftwaffe intervention, hunting down anything bearing a swastika that dared to move on the roads in daylight. Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's ruthless fireman, was rushed westward to bolster Army Group B after von Kluge's wavering loyalty raised fatal suspicions in Berlin. Model arrived to find a front that was not just retreating, but actively disintegrating. His famously energetic and brutal command style immediately clashed with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of his subordinates. Urgent, desperate pleas for reinforcements echoed through the command chain. The German 7th Army and Panzer Group West were staring directly at encirclement and annihilation as American armor hooked northward from Le Mans, driving relentlessly toward Argenton. At the Wolf's Lair on August 7th, the daily situation conference unfolded in a suffocating, terrifying silence. The massive oak tables were covered in maps showing Allied red arrows piercing impossibly deep into occupied territory. Patton's Third Army had advanced over 100 miles in a single week. They were liberating vast swaths of Brittany while simultaneously driving a stake into the heart of France. Hitler paced the room, his face violently flushed, slamming his fists and demanding impossible explanations. Jodl pointed a trembling finger at the red markings. American forces were at Laval-Angers. Chartres was within artillery reach. The Seine River lay totally exposed. Paris, the crown jewel of Hitler's occupied Europe, was already stirring with the violent unrest of the French resistance. Disbelief rippled through the German general staff. German military doctrine had literally written the book on rapid maneuver, the legendary Blitzkrieg that had conquered France in a matter of weeks in 1940. Yet here, an American general was executing their own doctrine with far greater audacity. brilliantly exploiting the fatal weaknesses the Wehrmacht had created for itself through Hitler's obsession with static defense. Refusing to accept the collapse, Hitler fixated on a delusional masterstroke. He personally ordered Operation Lutic, a massive armored counter-offensive launched on August 7th toward Mortain, designed to slice violently through the American lines and cut off the Avranches corridor. It was a spectacular, bloody failure. The attacking German panzers drove straight into a highly organized wall of American anti-tank defenses. As the morning fog lifted, the skies filled with Allied fighter bombers. The slaughter was catastrophic. Hundreds of German tanks were systematically destroyed from the air or abandoned by their panicked crews for lack of gasoline. As the days blurred into the second week of August, the High Command watched the maps in mounting paralyzed horror. By August 10th, the catastrophic scope of Patton's maneuver crystallized. His eastern thrusts had reached Orléans, threatening to completely outflank the entire German position in Normandy. The jaws of the Falaise pocket were rapidly forming. Canadian and British forces pushed ruthlessly south from Caen, while American armor drove north from Argenton. Inside this rapidly shrinking corridor of death, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were effectively trapped. Intercepted radio traffic confirmed Patton's personal hand in the carnage, endless exhortations for speed, a total disdain for caution, and the ruthless promise of total victory. August 15th saw Patton's armored units violently cross the Loire River in multiple locations, establishing heavily contested bridging sites under relentless enemy fire. Chartres was liberated. Dreux fell shortly after. In Paris, the streets buzzed with open rebellion as resistance barricades rose in anticipation of the liberators. In a fatal oversight by the retreating Germans, the vital bridges across the Seine remained largely intact in many sectors. Von Kluge, deeply implicated in the July bomb plot through his associations, vanished for hours while driving westward to oversee the chaotic withdrawal, sparking paranoid rumors of treason and secret negotiations with the Allies. He would soon commit suicide. Model assumed total, frantic command, issuing desperate directives to extricate whatever fighting forces he could from the rapidly closing Falaise pocket. On August 17th, the Falaise jaws clamped brutally shut. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped. The narrow escape corridors were jammed with burning vehicles, shattered horse-drawn artillery, and the dead, all pounded around the clock by merciless Allied artillery and relentless strafing runs. The absolute flower of the Western Panzer Force, the terrifying 1st SS, the 2nd Panzer, the 12th SS Hitlerjugend, faced complete tactical annihilation in a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. Hitler, screaming in his bunker conferences, desperately assigned blame to everyone but himself. Cowardly traitors, incompetent subordinates, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. Yet the underlying realization gnawed at the core of the High Command. The impregnable Western Front had collapsed with stunning, unbelievable rapidity under the sheer violence of Patton's drive. By August 20th, the vanguard patrols of the American Third Army entered the Paris suburbs amid a massive civilian uprising. Free French forces battled German collaborators in the streets, restrained by higher command to allow Charles de Gaulle's representatives the political honor of entering the city first. Patton simply shrugged, veered his heavy armored divisions eastward, and barreled straight toward the Seine crossings. The arithmetic of the disaster was breathtaking. In precisely 2 weeks, a mere 336 hours, Patton's Third Army had executed the crossing of France. They had liberated half the country. They had completely shattered the combat cohesion of the German 7th Army, inflicting casualties exceeding 200,000 men while losing only a fraction in comparison. In their cold, concrete bunkers and requisitioned chateaus, the surviving German commanders stared into the abyss. Maps that were supposed to show fortified defensive lines holding for months now showed Allied spearheads leapfrogging across rivers, cities, and provinces in a matter of days. Patton's ghost army deception measures prior to D-Day had successfully inflated his perceived strength and paralyzed German decision-making, but the terrifying reality of his actual army was far worse. The High Command saw with cold, devastating clarity that the Western theater was irrevocably transformed. This was no longer a war of containment. It was a desperate, bloody pursuit. The road to the German homeland lay wide open, the vaunted Siegfried Line fortifications, totally neglected amid the brutal demands of the Eastern Front, awaited the American onslaught completely unprepared. The shock of those 14 days, endured long after the autumn rains, turned the battlefields to mud. The crossing of France was etched into military history as the exact moment the tactical initiative irrevocably shifted. The Blitzkrieg, the terrifying engine of destruction that the Wehrmacht had perfected, had just been ruthlessly turned against its inventors. France, occupied for 4 agonizing years, had been violently pried from German hands in a single fortnight by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of one army. History Uncovered. Subscribe to Solid Tales.